The international terminal announcement echoed as cold as the way my sister's fiancé had just vanished with the entire family fortune. Meredith stood frozen in the terminal, her simple yet expensive wedding dress suddenly becoming a shroud for her own love story. He was gone, taking the family stocks and leaving my sister as prey for the phone cameras waiting for a socialite's downfall. Just as her breath turned to lead and her legs were about to give out, a tall shadow fell across the marble floor. Everett Vaughn stepped forward, elegant and dangerous like a restrained storm, the scent of sandalwood radiating from him, overpowering the stifling airport air. He leaned in close, his hot breath touching my sister's pale ear, whispering a sentence that inverted reality. "Pretend I'm your fiancée, Meredith." Without waiting for consent, Everett roughly yet possessively tightened his grip on my sister's waist, pulling her flush against his firm chest. He pulled out his phone and barked an order in a tone that made every onlooker hold their breath. "Cancel every flight. No one leaves this building until I find the man who dared to touch my woman." The entire airport went silent, and in that moment my sister knew the traitor had officially signed his own death warrant. If you want to discover how this fake marriage became a weapon of absolute destruction against those who betrayed me, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single chapter of this unfolding drama. The sudden weight of Everett's hand on mine sent a jolt of electricity through my numbed nerves, while the gasps from the surrounding guests blurred into a dissonant hum. I stared at him with a mixture of terror and desperation because his presence was the only thing keeping the encroaching darkness of humiliation at bay. Before I could process the insanity of his proposal, the heavy oak doors of the bridal suite swung open with a violent thud that echoed against the high ceilings. My younger sister Jillian marched into the room with her face contorted in a mask of artificial outrage that poorly hid the glint of satisfaction in her eyes. She did not offer a word of comfort, or even look at my tear-stained face, but instead turned toward the remaining bridesmaids to broadcast my shame. "You have always been the perfect one with your high-flying career and your expensive taste." Jillian spat the words at me while her voice rose to a shrill pitch that ensured everyone in the hallway could hear. She accused me of dragging the Miller family name through the mud by failing to keep a man like Garrett at the altar even for a single afternoon. The envy she had harbored for years over my position as the chief financial officer finally boiled over in a torrent of vitriol that made my skin crawl. I watched her pace around the room like a vulture, mocking my white silk gown and laughing at the empty space where my husband should have stood. The silence from my parents' direction was equally agonizing, yet it was Jillian's relentless verbal assault that cut deeper than Garrett's sudden disappearance. As I moved toward the mahogany vanity to regain some semblance of dignity, my gaze fell upon the small concealed safe where I had stored my personal documents. The door was slightly ajar, a sight that made my heart plummet into my stomach because I knew exactly what was supposed to be inside. I lunged forward to check the contents only to find that my passport, the original property deeds, and my private stock certificates had been wiped clean. A cold realization washed over me as I remembered Jillian had been the only person with me in this room earlier this morning. I turned to confront her, my voice trembling not with sadness, but with a burning rage that finally eclipsed my initial shock. "You gave him the key?" I whispered the accusation while my eyes locked onto hers, watching the brief flicker of guilt vanish behind her stubborn arrogance. Jillian did not even attempt to deny the theft. Instead, she smirked and suggested that Garrett deserved a consolation prize for having to put up with my rigid personality for so long. She had systematically dismantled my life in a matter of hours by handing my traitorous fiancé the tools to ruin me financially. My sister had transitioned from a sibling rival to a direct saboteur who was willing to see me incarcerated just to see me fall from my pedestal. The betrayal felt like a physical blow to my chest, leaving me breathless in the center of the very room that was meant to celebrate my future. Everett stepped between us before the confrontation could escalate into physical violence, his shadow looming over Jillian until she was forced to take a step back. He did not raise his voice yet. The cold authority in his tone silenced her more effectively than any scream could have ever managed. I have seen the digital footprints of your recent activities. Jillian and I suggest you stop speaking before I decide to leak the footage of your little incident in Aspen last winter. His words acted like a physical muzzle, turning my sister's face a ghostly shade of white as she realized her own secrets were now in the hands of a man she could not manipulate. Everett turned back to me, his expression unreadable, but his grip on my hand remained firm and unyielding against the chaos. We are leaving this suite immediately because staying here allows these vultures to pick at your bones while your assets are being drained across the border. He was right about the urgency of the situation, since I was now a woman without a legal identity or the means to defend my own wealth. The realization that I had no choice but to follow him into this charade was a bitter pill to swallow, yet the alternative was to stay and be torn apart by my own blood. I looked at Jillian one last time, seeing the hatred that radiated from her even in her silence, and I knew that our relationship was severed beyond any hope of repair. I would never forgive the woman who shared my DNA for hand-delivering my life to a criminal like Garrett. We walked out of the room together, leaving the whispers behind as we prepared to face a ceremony that was no longer about love, but about survival. The heavy bronze bells of the Valley Church began to toll exactly at 11 o'clock as the sound reverberated through the lakeside villa to signal the scheduled start of a wedding that was already dead. I stood paralyzed in the center of the suite, while the ringing felt like a hammer against my skull, marking the precise moment my planned future officially turned into a public execution. Before the final echo could fade away, the double doors burst open once more to admit my parents, Douglas Miller and Miriam Miller, who stormed in with faces flushed not with concern, but with sheer panic. My father did not even glance at my pale face or the disheveled state of my bridal gown. Instead, he immediately began pacing the floor while clutching a crumpled financial report. My mother followed close behind him, her eyes darting toward Everett with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, yet she remained silent as Dad began to shout about the morning's stock market opening. "Meredith, you have to find Garrett right now because our entire family legacy is tied to the merger he was supposed to finalize," after the ceremony Dad yelled, while ignoring the fact that his daughter had just been abandoned. I stared at him in disbelief as I realized that his primary concern was the falling price of Miller Global shares, rather than the emotional wreckage of my life. When I informed them that Garrett had vanished with my dowry and the corporate stocks, my mother finally spoke, but her words were a sharp reprimand about the social embarrassment we would face at the country club. I watched these two people who had raised me and suddenly saw them as total strangers who viewed my existence only as a strategic asset to be traded for market stability. The air in the room grew suffocating as Dad finally stopped pacing to look me in the eye, his expression hardening into something cold and transactional that made my blood run cold. He confessed with a chilling lack of remorse that he had been fully aware of Garrett's history of fraudulent activities and unstable tech ventures long before the engagement was even announced. He admitted that he had deliberately pushed me into this marriage to use Garrett's supposed venture capital connections as a smokescreen to hide the massive debts our corporation had accumulated over the last year. I felt the floor drop out from under my feet as the realization hit me that my own parents had hand-delivered me to a predator just to keep their failing empire afloat for a few more months. "You were always the most resilient child, so we figured you would manage him once the legal ties were solidified and the family wealth was secured," Mom added with a shrug that made me want to scream in agony. They had gambled with my life and my happiness as if I were nothing more than a high-stakes poker chip in a game they were already losing to a man like Garrett. The practical cruelty of the American upper class was laid bare in that moment, because my own flesh and blood were willing to see me destroyed for the sake of a fading reputation. I turned away from them, my heart hardening into a cold stone, while I looked at Everett, who had been standing in the shadows watching this pathetic display of parental betrayal. Everett chose that moment to step into the light, his presence suddenly dwarfing my father's frantic energy and commanding the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He reached into his suit jacket to pull out a silver folder, his eyes fixed on Dad with a predatory glint that signaled a shift in the balance of power. "I have been watching your desperate maneuvers for months, Douglas, and you should know that I was the one who quietly bought up every single one of your company's bad debts through my various holding firms." My father's jaw dropped as he processed the news that his former rival now held the literal keys to his entire financial survival and his personal mansion. The room fell into an eerie silence while Mom gripped her pearls, her gaze shifting from me to Everett, as she realized that the man they once looked down upon was now their absolute master. Everett's position had transformed from a discarded lover to the most powerful person in my life, and he was the only thing standing between the Millers and a total public collapse. I looked at the broken people who claimed to be my parents and felt a sudden sharp surge of motivation to reclaim my life from their manipulative hands. The rot at the core of the Miller family had been exposed by the tolling bells of Lake Tahoe, and I knew that my path forward would involve a revenge that would leave none of them standing. Exactly 20 minutes after the explosive confrontation with my parents, Everett led me into the secluded library of the villa, where the scent of old leather and mahogany offered a fleeting sense of sanctuary. He closed the heavy double doors to lock out the frantic shouting of Dad and the pathetic weeping of Mom that still echoed through the marble hallways. Everett did not waste time with hollow comforts. Instead, he cleared a space on the massive desk and laid out a thick stack of legal documents that had clearly been prepared in anticipation of this very disaster. He explained that these papers were a specialized marriage contract and a series of ironclad trusts designed to place my remaining assets under a protected corporate umbrella. By signing these documents, I would effectively terminate Dad's legal standing as a trustee over my inheritance and strip him of any authority to manage the funds that still carried the Miller name. The strategy was a surgical strike against the family that had tried to auction off my life because it utilized a loophole in California's community property laws through an immediate post-nuptial filing. My hand trembled as I hovered over the signature line, realizing that this act would officially mark the end of my life as a Miller and the beginning of a cold alliance with a man I once loved. While I hesitated, Everett's private phone vibrated on the table, and he immediately placed it on speaker to allow a familiar voice to cut through the oppressive tension. My best friend Pierce, who is also a high-level cybersecurity specialist, spoke with a clinical precision that immediately anchored my spiraling thoughts. He had spent the last hour infiltrating the digital trail left by Garrett, and his findings were far more disturbing than a simple case of a groom getting cold feet. Pierce reported that Garrett was currently traveling toward the Canadian border, using a high-quality forged identity under the name of Julian Vane, which he had secured months ago. He had already liquidated the physical stock certificates at a private brokerage in Reno and was attempting to move the capital into an offshore account that Pierce was struggling to track. Hearing my friend's voice provided the emotional support I needed to push past the paralysis of betrayal, because I knew I wasn't fighting this battle entirely alone. Pierce warned me that if I didn't act within the hour to secure my legal status, Garrett would have enough time to finish the transfer and leave me with nothing but a mountain of family debt. The internal struggle raging inside me was a violent storm of pride and survival as I stared at the man standing across the desk from me. I knew that becoming Everett's legal wife was a dangerous gamble, yet it was the only weapon powerful enough to destroy the people who had treated me like a disposable commodity. I took a deep breath to steady my racing heart before pressing the pen into the paper with enough force to leave an indentation on the mahogany surface. The act of signing my name felt like a rebirth of sorts, a definitive moment where I shed the skin of a victim and stepped into the role of a calculated strategist. Everett picked up the papers with a nod of grim approval, his eyes reflecting a newfound respect for the ruthlessness I had just displayed by disinheriting my own father. He informed me that his lawyers were already standing by at the county clerk's office to expedite the filing under a special emergency provision for high net worth individuals facing immediate asset dissipation. This was no longer a fairy tale wedding at Lake Tahoe. It was a hostile takeover of my own destiny that left no room for sentimentality or forgiveness. Pierce stayed on the line to begin the process of freezing every secondary account associated with the Miller estate, effectively trapping Garrett's stolen funds in a digital limbo. I stood tall in my tattered bridal gown and looked at the closed doors, feeling a cold fire ignite in my chest as I prepared to reclaim everything that had been taken from me. The golden light of sunset began to spill across the glassy surface of Lake Tahoe as Everett and I stepped onto the expansive terrace to face a sea of expectant faces. We moved with a practiced grace that masked the cold fury vibrating through my veins, while the scent of expensive champagne mingled with the crisp mountain air. Every smile I offered to the circle of high-profile investors was a calculated move in a high-stakes game of corporate survival, designed to project an image of absolute stability. I could see the vultures of the financial press circling the perimeter of the garden, their cameras ready to capture any sign of a crack in the Miller family facade. Everett kept his hand possessively on the small of my back to signify a united front that effectively silenced the whispered rumors about Garrett's suspicious absence. We looked like the quintessential power couple of Northern California, two titans of industry, joining forces to create a new era of dominance in the retail sector. Jillian appeared near the refreshment table with her face twisted into a mask of bitterness, her fingers flying across her phone screen as she attempted to send a series of damaging leaks to the local tabloids. I watched her from the corner of my eye, knowing that she was desperate to ruin the evening and regain the leverage she had lost in the bridal suite. However, Pierce had already established a digital perimeter around the estate, effectively rerouting every outgoing message from Jillian's device into a dead-end server. The look of frantic confusion on my sister's face when her attempts to sabotage me failed was the first moment of genuine satisfaction I had felt since the sun rose. She was realizing that her petty malice was no match for the sophisticated technological warfare my best friend was currently waging on my behalf. As the lead investors gathered around the central fountain, I took the opportunity to step forward and address the crowd with the sharp authority of a chief financial officer. I calmly announced that the Miller Global Corporation would be undergoing an immediate and aggressive restructuring process to focus on digital expansion and asset protection. The murmurs of approval from the board members were almost deafening as they processed the news that the company was pivoting away from the risky ventures Garrett had proposed. I spoke about efficiency and transparency while my heart pounded against my ribs, knowing that every word was a nail in the coffin of my father's outdated management style. The power shift was palpable in the cool evening air as the investors began to turn their attention away from Douglas and toward me for the first time in my career. Everett chose that precise moment to cement our dominance by announcing his firm's commitment to a $50 million investment into a new independent venture under my sole leadership. The collective gasp from the crowd confirmed that the balance of power had officially tipped, leaving the old guard of the Miller family standing in the shadows of their own event. Dad and Mom stood on the periphery of the terrace, their faces pale with a mixture of terror and realization as they watched their influence evaporate like the mountain mist. They were witnessing the birth of a new empire that they could neither control nor benefit from a reality that seemed to age them by a decade in a single hour. My father's attempts to interject were silenced by the cold stares of his peers who now viewed him as a liability rather than a leader. While the masquerade continued under the flickering candlelight of the dinner tables, Pierce's voice came through my earpiece with a series of urgent updates regarding our primary target. He had successfully bypassed the encryption on Garrett's secondary laptop and was now providing a live stream of data that proved the extent of the theft. The appearance of Pierce in this phase of the plan was no longer about providing a shoulder to lean on, but about providing the cold, hard evidence required to destroy Garrett's life. He informed me that the frozen accounts had successfully trapped over $3 million of my stolen capital, leaving Garrett with almost no resources to continue his flight. We were closing the digital net around him with a precision that left no room for error or escape, transforming the evening into a countdown for his inevitable arrest. The contrast between the elegant music playing in the background and the brutal financial execution taking place beneath the surface was the intoxicating blend of glamour and vengeance. I looked out over the darkened lake and felt a sense of clarity that only comes when you have truly lost everything and decided to take it all back. The masquerade was working perfectly because the world saw a beautiful bride and a powerful husband, while we were actually two hunters closing in on their prey. I raised my glass to the investors, offering a toast to the future while my mind was already 3 steps ahead in the game of destruction I had set in motion. The villa at Lake Tahoe was no longer a place of celebration for me. It was the war room where I would finally bury the ghosts of my past and the people who tried to sell my soul. The chilling mist of 2 in the morning crawled across the dark waters of Lake Tahoe to swallow the villa in a ghostly shroud while the rest of the guests remained oblivious in their drunken slumber. I stood in the center of the dimly lit study with Everett as the blue light from Pierce's multiple monitors illuminated our tired faces with a cold digital glow. Pierce had finally breached the final firewall of a roadside guest house near the Washington border, pinpointing Garrett's exact location through a careless login to a premium streaming service. It was a pathetic mistake for a man who claimed to be a tech genius, yet it provided the definitive coordinates we needed to end this exhausting hunt once and for all. Garrett was currently hiding in a dilapidated room, preparing to cross into Canada at dawn by using a backup credit card that Dad had secretly provided weeks ago. I felt a surge of adrenaline wash away my fatigue as I turned toward Everett and demanded that he activate the emergency freeze on every subsidiary account linked to the Miller Global Group. Everett complied without hesitation, his fingers moving across the keyboard to execute the financial blackout that would leave Garrett completely stranded in a foreign state. The moment the confirmation light flashed green, I picked up the burner phone Pierce had prepared and dialed the number Garrett thought was still secure. The line crackled for several agonizing seconds before a familiar, arrogant voice answered with a cautious greeting that made my skin crawl with visceral disgust. I did not waste time with tears or pleas. Instead, I informed him in a voice as cold as the mountain air that his flight had officially reached its terminal point. You should look out the window, Garrett, because the federal agents are already coordinating with the local sheriff to ensure you never see the northern side of that border, I said, while listening to his breath hitch in a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to stammer a pathetic excuse about doing it all for our future, but I cut him off by revealing that I had already signed a new marriage contract with a man who actually understood the meaning of loyalty. I explained that every transaction he had attempted since leaving the villa was being monitored by a specialized task force that Pierce had alerted hours ago. The silence on the other end of the line was the most beautiful sound I had heard all day because it signaled the total collapse of his narcissistic delusions. Garrett finally broke the silence with a desperate snarl, accusing me of being a heartless bitch who had traded one master for another, yet his insults only served to solidify my resolve. I told him that I was reclaiming every cent of the dowry he had stolen, and that Jillian would soon be joining him in a courtroom to answer for her part in this conspiracy. After I ended the call, I felt a strange sense of emptiness that was quickly replaced by a sharp realization about the man standing silently by my side. Everett had been too efficient and too prepared for this specific disaster, which made me wonder if his return to my life was truly motivated by a lingering spark of old affection. Everett must have sensed my growing suspicion because he turned to face me with an expression that was devoid of the warmth he had projected earlier in the evening. He admitted that his primary goal in helping me was to facilitate a massive repossession of assets that Garrett's family had embezzled from the Vaughn estate over 2 decades ago. It turned out that the corporate stocks Garrett had stolen were the final pieces of a puzzle Everett had been trying to solve since his own father was ruined by a similar betrayal. I realized in that moment that everyone in this high-stakes game had a hidden agenda, and that I was simply the most useful player on the board for his long-awaited vengeance. This revelation didn't break me as the earlier betrayals had. Instead, it acted as a final forge that tempered my spirit into something much harder and more resilient than the woman who had walked down the aisle. I looked at Everett and acknowledged that while our alliance was built on mutual convenience and shared enemies, I was no longer a victim to be manipulated by any man. The high-tension drama of the night had reached its peak as we watched the digital icons on the screen signal the arrival of law enforcement at the guest house. The trap we had set together was finally closing, and as the first light of dawn began to gray the horizon, I knew that the era of being a pawn was officially over. I was now a player in my own right, and I would ensure that every person who had used me would pay a price they could never afford. The morning sun began to cut through the lingering fog at 8 o'clock, precisely as the harsh glare of reality illuminated the grand foyer of the Lake Tahoe villa. I stood at the top of the marble staircase and watched as the heavy front doors were thrown open by a team of federal agents who moved with a clinical efficiency that signaled the end of our family's charade. Jillian was intercepted near the breakfast buffet while she was trying to hide her encrypted laptop beneath a silk shawl, but the officers were too fast for her clumsy attempts at concealment. She was immediately informed of her rights and charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and the theft of trade secrets that belonged exclusively to my private holdings. I watched my sister's face crumple into a mask of pure terror as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists in front of the remaining guests and staff. She screamed my name and begged for me to intervene, yet I remained as motionless as a statue, while her voice echoed uselessly against the high vaulted ceilings of the estate. My parents rushed into the foyer after hearing the commotion, but the sight of their youngest daughter being led away in a police cruiser seemed to drain the very life from their faces. Dad looked like he had aged 20 years in a single night as he turned toward me with a desperate plea for a financial bailout to save the Miller legacy from the impending scandal. I didn't wait for him to finish his rehearsed speech about family loyalty. Instead, I handed him a legal envelope containing a formal notice of my immediate withdrawal from the corporate board. I looked him directly in the eyes and explained that I was pulling every cent of my personal capital and the Vaughn investment out of the firm, effective immediately. This decision meant that Miller Global would be insolvent by the time the stock market opened in New York, effectively ending Douglas Miller's reign as a titan of industry. The silence that followed my announcement was heavier than any argument we had ever had, because Mom began to weep with a frantic intensity that no longer moved my heart. She tried to grab my arm and remind me of the sacrifices they had made for my education, but I stepped back and presented the restraining order my lawyers had secured just an hour ago. I told them both that they were no longer permitted to contact me or enter any property registered under my name without a legal representative present. The practical cruelty they had shown me yesterday had returned to haunt them in the form of a total and irreversible social and financial exile. I was no longer their daughter or their CFO. I was the woman who was finally burning down the prison they had built for me with their own hands. As the sun rose higher in the sky, a second black SUV pulled into the driveway to deliver the news we had been waiting for regarding the fugitive at the border. Pierce stepped out of the vehicle with a tablet in his hand, showing me the live footage of Garrett being processed at a federal holding facility in Reno before his extradition to New York. The man who had planned to ruin me was now just another prisoner in a standard orange jumpsuit, his arrogance completely stripped away by the cold reality of a 15-year sentence. Pierce had provided the final digital fingerprints that linked Garrett's offshore transfers directly to the stolen stocks, ensuring that there was no legal loophole large enough for him to crawl through. Every piece of evidence was meticulously organized to ensure that the prosecution would have an airtight case against everyone involved in the conspiracy. Everett stood by the fountain and watched the final remnants of the Miller family power structure being dismantled with a quiet intensity that reminded me of our complicated alliance. He had achieved his goal of reclaiming his family's stolen assets, but the cost had been the total destruction of the only family I had ever known. I walked past my father one last time as he sat on a stone bench with his head in his hands, realizing that his greed had finally left him with nothing but a mountain of lawsuits. The investors who had once praised his vision were already sending out press releases to distance themselves from the Miller name and its radioactive reputation. I felt no joy in their suffering, only a profound sense of relief that the weight of their expectations was finally gone from my shoulders. The transition from a betrayed bride to a woman who had orchestrated the downfall of her enemies was complete as I looked at the shimmering lake for the last time. This villa was no longer a symbol of my failure, but a monument to the moment I decided to stop being a victim and start being a victor. I signaled for Pierce and Everett to join me at the car because there was nothing left for me in this house of cards except for bitter memories and broken promises. We drove away from the estate just as the church bells began to ring for a Sunday service that I would never attend. The era of the Millers was over, and as the gates of the villa closed behind us, I knew that the path ahead of me was finally mine to choose without anyone else's interference. 1 month had passed since the traumatic events at Lake Tahoe, and the cool, salty breeze of San Francisco now provided a refreshing contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of my former life. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new boutique investment firm, looking out at the Golden Gate Bridge while the morning sunlight reflected off the glass of my pristine desk. This office was not a gift from my family or a strategic move by a husband, but a sanctuary I had built using the recovered assets Pierce had successfully traced. The legal system had moved with surprising speed, delivering a sense of closure that I never thought possible when I was standing at that altar in a torn wedding dress. Garrett had recently been sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole due to the severity of his interstate financial crimes. The court had also ordered him to pay full restitution for the funds he had attempted to embezzle, ensuring that his path to recovery would be blocked for the rest of his natural life. My sister Jillian did not escape the consequences of her jealousy, though her punishment took a different but equally devastating form in the eyes of the elite. She was currently serving a 3-year term of probation for her role as an accessory to the theft, yet the true sentence was the absolute cold shoulder she received from every social circle in the city. The sister who once lived for the spotlight was now a pariah, forced to live in a modest apartment while enduring the silent judgment of the peers she had tried so hard to impress. Meanwhile, the Miller Global Group had officially declared Chapter 7 bankruptcy, leaving Dad and Mom to face the total liquidation of their properties and personal collections. I watched from a distance as they moved out of the family mansion, realizing that their obsession with corporate image had ultimately left them with nothing but empty rooms and broken promises. Everett visited my office yesterday to finalize the paperwork that would officially dissolve our emergency marriage, a process that we both handled with the clinical efficiency of seasoned business partners. There were no tears or dramatic farewells this time, because we both understood that our alliance had served its purpose in dismantling our common enemies. We signed the divorce decree with steady hands, agreeing to maintain a fair and transparent professional relationship as we both invested in the same emerging technology markets. He offered a nod of genuine respect before leaving, acknowledging that I was no longer the girl he had left behind years ago, but a formidable peer who could hold her own in any boardroom. I felt a profound sense of lightness as the door closed, knowing that I finally belonged to myself and was no longer a pawn in anyone else's grand design. This journey through betrayal and rebirth taught me a bitter but essential lesson about the dangers of placing absolute financial trust in people just because they share your DNA. I realized that toxic family dynamics can be just as predatory as any criminal scheme if you allow sentimental loyalty to blind you to the reality of their actions. My parents and Jillian did not view me as a person, but as a resource to be exploited, a mistake I will never repeat, regardless of how much time passes or how many apologies they offer. The true foundation of a woman's security is not a prestigious family name or a wealthy husband, but her own independent spirit and the sharp intellect she cultivates through adversity. I have traded the hollow glamour of the Miller legacy for the authentic freedom of a self-made life, and the cost was worth every moment of the struggle. The scars of that weekend at Lake Tahoe still remain, but they serve as a constant reminder of the strength I discovered when I was pushed to the absolute edge of my endurance. I have surrounded myself with people like Pierce who value integrity over image, creating a circle of support that is built on mutual respect rather than strategic convenience. As I prepare to start my first meeting of the day, I feel a quiet confidence that can only come from knowing you have survived the worst and emerged even stronger. To those of you who have followed my story through every twist and turn, I want to express my deepest gratitude for your presence and your patience. Your support has been a silent anchor for me while I navigated the storms of betrayal and the difficult path toward total independence. I sincerely hope that my story serves as a beacon for anyone who feels trapped by the expectations of others or the weight of a toxic family heritage. Real power is not about how much you inherit, but about how much you are willing to fight for when the world tries to take everything away from you. I would truly value hearing your perspectives on how I handled the situation with my father and my sister, as these decisions were the hardest I have ever had to make. Should blood always be thicker than water, or is there a point where the ties that bind us must be severed for our own survival? Thank you for listening to my journey until the very last second, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the price of freedom.